April 15, 1945. A makeshift hospital tent on the outskirts of Remagen, Germany. In the final desperate push of a crumbling empire, young German nurses like Anna had been raised on tales of American soldiers as heartless barbarians, ready to ravage and destroy anyone in a uniform. Yet as U.S. forces breached the Rhine and surrounded their outpost, what emerged from the smoke was not vengeance, but an outstretched hand, offering aid to the very women who had patched up the enemy just hours before. This unexpected turn shattered the iron grip of propaganda, pulling Anna into a world where humanity flickered amid the ruins. Little did she know, this moment would carry her across oceans, forcing her to question everything she held true. The air inside the tent hung heavy with the scent of blood and iodine, the kind that seeped into your clothes and skin no matter how many times you washed. Anna, just 22, moved between the cots with the quiet efficiency drilled into her during training back in Berlin. She was one of the Helferinnen, young women from good families who volunteered to serve the fatherland in roles like nursing, believing it was their duty to keep the Wehrmacht strong. Her uniform, once crisp and proud, was now stained and torn from weeks on the line during the Ardennes counteroffensive, that last gamble Hitler had thrown against the Allies in December 1944. Every bandage she wrapped, every feverish forehead she cooled, felt like a small victory against the tide turning against them. But victories were fleeting now. Supplies dwindled faster than the snow melted in the forests of Belgium and Germany. Anna remembered the propaganda films shown in her youth, depicting Americans as soft, materialistic gangsters from a decadent society, their soldiers undisciplined and driven by greed rather than honor. They fight for money, not ideals, her instructors had said, showing cartoons of fat capitalists pulling strings behind the lines. It made sense in the abstract. Germany's soldiers were lean, fueled by willpower and the promise of a 1,000-year Reich. Yet here, in the dim light of oil lamps, reality bit harder. By early 1945, the German army faced severe shortages. Medical kits that once held ample morphine and gauze now offered little. Much vaunted science was failing them all. The breaking point came with the rumble of tanks in the distance. Remagen, a quiet town on the Rhine, had become a flashpoint when U.S. engineers seized the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7th, pouring thousands of troops across what was supposed to be an unbreakable barrier. For the Germans, it was disaster. Hitler's orders to destroy the bridge had come too late, and now the Allies flooded westward. Anna's unit, attached to a retreating infantry division, set up this hasty aid station to handle the wounded from skirmishes around the town. By April, the front was collapsing. Intelligence reports spoke of over 300,000 German troops encircled in the Ruhr pocket nearby, their surrender imminent. In those tense hours, Anna treated a steady stream of casualties, some with wounds so fresh the blood still pulsed. One soldier, a boy no older than 18, gasped out stories of the American advance, endless columns of Sherman tanks, supported by fighter bombers that darkened the sky. "They have fuel for days," he muttered, before slipping into unconsciousness. It was a simple fact, but it stuck with her. Germany's panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, now stalled for lack of gasoline, their crews siphoning from abandoned vehicles just to move. The U.S. Army, by contrast, rolled on with logistical might. Their supply lines stretched back to ports in France, delivering millions of gallons of fuel weekly through a network of trucks and pipelines that boggled the mind. Anna paused to wipe sweat from her brow, her thoughts drifting to the life she had left behind. Raised in a middle-class home in Munich, she had joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel as a teen, singing songs of unity and strength. Nursing school followed, where instructors praised the Reich's advancements in medicine. Sterile techniques, new drugs like Pervitin to keep soldiers alert. But those were the early days. Now, with the Allies closing in, the tent felt like a fragile bubble about to burst. She glanced at her colleague, Greta, who was stitching a gash on a lieutenant's arm. "What will they do to us?" Greta whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wounded onto trucks for evacuation, but orders came to hold position. More casualties were incoming." In the chaos, she overheard officers arguing about fuel rations, their voices laced with desperation. The Wehrmacht, once a machine of conquest, now limped on fumes and false hopes. Simple numbers told the story. By spring 1945, Allied air power had destroyed over 70% of Germany's synthetic fuel plants, leaving tanks idle and planes grounded. For Anna, it wasn't just strategy, it was personal. The endless American resources meant their end was near. When the first U.S. patrols appeared at dawn, silhouetted against the rising sun, Anna's world tilted. She stood frozen, scalpel still in hand from an unfinished procedure, as soldiers in olive drab entered the tent with rifles lowered. The air crackled with tension, but no shots rang out. Instead, a medic in a helmet marked with a red cross approached, his face weary but calm. "We're here to help," he said in halting German, gesturing to the wounded. Anna blinked, the words not matching the monster she had been taught to expect. In that instant, the first crack appeared in the wall of her beliefs, pulling her toward a journey she could never have imagined. Hands raised in the dim light of dawn, Anna watched the U.S. soldiers fan out through the hospital tent, their boots crunching softly on the dew-wet grass outside. Every nerve in her body screamed to run or fight, but the weight of exhaustion and the rifles trained on them kept her rooted. The stories drilled into her mind painted these men as savage opportunists, men who would strip them of dignity and worse, especially the women among the captured. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the lead sergeant, a tall figure with a face etched by months of combat, scanned the room and barked orders in English that the German interpreter relayed. "Lay down arms and gather for processing." The surrender unfolded with a mechanical calm that stunned Anna. No rough shoves or shouted insults, just efficient hands collecting weapons and medical tools, sorting the wounded from the able-bodied. The Americans moved like a well-oiled machine, their medics immediately tending to the overflow of patients on the cots, sharing bandages and morphine. A slit in the canvas, catching glimpses of the American convoy snaking behind. Endless lines of jeeps, half-tracks, and those Sherman tanks that seemed to multiply like rabbits. It was the sheer volume that hit her first. No pauses for refueling, no desperate scavenging. In the Ardennes, her unit had watched their own panzers grind to a halt, crews rationing every drop of precious fuel siphoned from wrecks. Here, the Allies pressed on relentlessly, their supply depots back in France pumping out resources on a scale the Reich could only dream of. By midday, they reached a makeshift holding area near Bonn, a fenced field ringed by barbed wire and guarded towers, where hundreds of other Germans milled about, soldiers, officers, even civilians caught in the sweep. Over 80,000 troops had surrendered in the Ardennes offensive alone, the sergeant mentioned casually to his men, a number that echoed in Anna's mind like a death knell. She and the other nurses were directed to a separate tent, given blankets and a hot meal of stew and bread that was still soft, not the hard crusts they knew. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, Anna ate slowly. The flavors, real meat, carrots, a hint of spice, foreign, after years of ersatz soups made from sawdust and turnips. It wasn't just food. It was proof of the propaganda's lie, the myth of a weak, starving America crumbling with each bite. In the tent that night, whispers circulated among the women. One nurse, Maria from Hamburg, recounted a tale from her capture earlier in the week. Americans had handed out cigarettes and chocolate to the men, treating them as fellow soldiers rather than vermin. "No beatings, no stripping," she said, her voice a mix of relief and confusion. Anna nodded, but doubt lingered. The instructors back home had warned of hidden cruelties, of how the Yankees' politeness masked their greed. They wanted slaves for their factories, women for their vices. Yet the guards outside patrolled without harassment, calling out only to check on the wounded. It felt too orderly, too humane for the monsters in the films. The next days blurred into interrogations and medical checks. The Americans' doctors, surprisingly thorough, noting fever. Able-bodied, like the nurses, farther still. Anna's group was selected for transport to France first, then by ship to the United States itself, where labor shortages demanded workers, even prisoners. The idea chilled her. Crossing the ocean to the heart of the enemy, a land of skyscrapers and jazz that propaganda called a den of moral decay. What awaited there? Factories belching smoke, or worse, the fates whispered about for captured women? She clutched her few belongings, a locket with her mother's photo, a worn prayer book, as the trucks revved for the journey south. The drive to the port at Antwerp took 2 days, weaving through liberated towns where civilians waved at the convoys, their faces a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. Anna saw children playing near rubble, American GIs handing out gum with broad smiles, scenes that clashed with the radio broadcasts she remembered. The West is crumbling under its own weight. Instead, reconstruction hummed. Engineers repairing bridges, supply trucks unloading crates stamped with red crosses full of medicines. By the time they boarded the Liberty ship in early May, the war in Europe was grinding to its end. Hitler dead by his own hand, Berlin falling to the Soviets. But for Anna, the real battle was just beginning. The Atlantic voyage a slow churn of dread and dawning questions about the world beyond the lies. Stepping onto Texas soil in late June 1945, the vast flatness of the land stretched out like an endless sea under a sky so blue it hurt Anna's eyes, a far cry from the shattered spires and smoke-choked horizons of home. The air was thick with heat and the scent of dry grass, nothing like the damp chill of the Rhine. She and the other nurses, about 50 in their group, disembarked from the train in a dusty yard, their legs shaky from the long voyage across the Atlantic. Whistles and shouts from U.S. guards directed them toward waiting trucks. But it was the sheer openness, the lack of walls closing in, that first unsettled her, making the world feel both freeing and exposed. The journey from the port in New Jersey had taken days, rattling through unfamiliar landscapes where farms rolled by without the pockmarks of bombs. Anna pressed her face to the window, watching family ranks, specialties, the interpreter translated, and Anna murmured her details, expecting scrutiny or worse. Instead, they handed out identification tags and directed the women to clean barracks with cots lined in neat rows, each with a thin mattress and wool blanket that smelled fresh from storage. Electric bulbs hung overhead, switched on with a flip that bathed the room in steady light. No flickering kerosene, no rationed hours of darkness. It was a simple thing, but to Anna it whispered of a power grid unbroken by war, a stability the Reich's blackouts had stolen away. That first evening, a mess hall meal waited, tin plates heaped with mashed potatoes, beans, and corned beef, accompanied by a steaming cup of real coffee, black, strong, and sweet with sugar packets on every table. Anna sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through her like a forgotten comfort. Back home, coffee had been a wartime myth, replaced by bitter acorns or chicory, but here it flowed freely, one small emblem of the industrial might that had crushed the Axis. The United States had held over 425,000 prisoners of war from Europe and the Pacific by the conflict's close, many in southern camps like this one, where the dry climate and open spaces made for what the guards called humane containment. Numbers like that, murmured among the POWs, painted a picture of an enemy not scrambling for survival, but expanding with ease. Sitting with Greta at a long wooden table, Anna felt the weight of it all. The food wasn't lavish, but it was consistent, 3 meals a day without the gnawing hunger that had shadowed her units in France. Whispers among the women turned to the guards' demeanor. No catcalls, no lingering stares, just men doing their jobs, some even tipping their hats when passing the women's area. The Geneva Convention ruled here, they learned, mandating separate quarters and medical care for female captives, a protection the Nazis had often flouted in their own camps. It stirred a quiet shame in Anna, recalling stories from the Eastern Front where Soviet women fared far worse under German occupation. Yet, this fairness, this lack of expected cruelty, chipped away at the image of Yankees as ruthless exploiters. Next morning, Anna braced herself for the humiliation she still half expected, stepping into a routine that would test her world all over again. Mornings began with the sharp bugle call at dawn, pulling Anna from her cot in the women's barracks. But what caught her off guard was the quiet respect in how the guards approached their quarters. No barking orders, just a simple nod as they counted heads. The routine settled in like a reluctant habit, dividing the day into shifts that left little room for the wild fears of the voyage. She and the other nurses rose early, folding their blankets with precision from old training, then filed out to the communal wash area where basins of hot water waited, a far cry from the icy streams they had used on the front. The camp's rhythm was methodical, almost peaceful under the Texas sun. After roll call, breakfast came in the mess hall. Oatmeal with canned milk and slices of white bread spread with jam that tasted like summer berries, not the watery paste of home. Anna ate with the group, conversations hushed at first, sticking to practical matters, who was assigned to laundry, who to the kitchen detail. But the women's section stood apart, a cluster of low buildings fenced separately from the men's, with paths lined by wildflowers that bloomed unchecked. The Geneva Convention, explained by a bilingual sergeant during orientation, laid out clear rules for such arrangements. Women prisoners received their own housing, privacy in daily needs, and access to doctors who checked for illnesses without prying eyes. It was a framework of fairness, one that Anna learned had been signed long before the war, binding even enemies to basic humanity. In practice, it meant no shared latrines with soldiers, no forced mixing that could lead to the degradations whispered about in captured letters. By mid-morning, Anna reported to the camp clinic, a sturdy frame building stocked with shelves of supplies that made her pause. Rows of glass jars held bandages, antiseptics, and bottles of penicillin, the miracle drug the Allies had mass-produced while Germany scraped for basics. Her days blurred into tending minor ailments, headaches from the heat, cuts from farm work some POWs did outside the wire, fevers that broke with a single dose rather than endless compresses. One afternoon, she helped affect shortages amid the ruins. Letters arrived sporadically, censored but vivid. Her mother's hands chapped from washing in cold water, her brother's cough from the damp shelters. Here, clean linens arrived weekly, laundered by machines in the camp's facility, sheets crisp and free of the lice that had plagued their field hospitals. Over 400,000 Axis prisoners filled U.S. camps by war's end, and the system stretched to feed and clothe them all, drawing on a farm belt that produced surpluses even in wartime. Anna wondered about the cost. Did this abundance come from exploiting others, as the propaganda claimed? Yet watching a guard share his own handkerchief with a sniffling child POW one day, she saw glimpses of personal kindness, not systemic greed, cracking the myths further. Evenings brought a slower pace. Women gathered in the rec yard for mending clothes or soft talks under the stars. Greta often spoke of her village near the Rhine, bombed flat in March, and how the American advance had spared the remnants. "They could have razed it all," she said one night, folding a sweater by lantern light. "But they didn't." The guards patrolled at a distance, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies, enforcing lights out without the brutality of Gestapo sweeps Anna remembered from training camps. It built a fragile trust, this routine of respect. But old shadows clung. Dreams woke her sweating, replaying the instructor's warnings of what capture meant for women. Not care, but conquest. Still, the days wore on, the clinic's demands pulling her deeper into a role that felt both familiar and foreign. One such demand came during a routine checkup for the women, a monthly affair in the clinic's side room. Anna waited her turn, heart quickening as the door opened to the next patient, an event that would soon turn her lingering doubts into something sharper and more personal. One evening, as the clinic lights hummed against the gathering dusk, a U.S. soldier was carried in on a stretcher, his uniform torn and dark with blood from shrapnel scattered during a training mishap out on the ranges. His name was Private Ellis, 20 years old, from a farm in Iowa, and as the medics laid him down, his eyes locked on Anna, wide with pain, but not the hatred she braced for in that moment. She had been assigned to tiny reminders of the war's reach, even in this safe backwater. Penicillin powder dusted the gashes, a drug so plentiful here that vials sat in open cabinets, unlike the single precious dose she had rationed for 10 men back in Remagen. Private Ellis grimaced but held still, his breath ragged, and when she finished the sutures with steady pulls of the needle, he managed a weak smile through the haze. "Thanks, Fraulein," he murmured in broken German, the word polite and unforced, like thanking a neighbor for a fence post. That simple gratitude hung in the air long after they wheeled him to recovery, a crack in the armor of everything Anna had been taught. Why offer thanks to the enemy, to a woman in a uniform stained with the blood of his side? Propaganda reels had shown GIs as brutes, looting and laughing over their kills. But this boy, pale and shivering, saw her only as a healer. It stirred a confusion in her chest, sharp as the iodine she applied. Cognitive pull between the monster myth and this flesh and blood reality. Some prisoners like her worked in these very hospitals, treating allies under watch, a fact the camp commander mentioned during briefings. By late 1945, hundreds of German medics contributed to U.S. facilities, their expertise a bridge no one planned, but everyone used. For Anna, it wasn't just duty. It was the first real dissonance, the polite Danke, echoing her own unspoken question. If he could see past the labels, what else had she missed? She washed her hands at the sink, the water running clear and endless, soap lathering without sting, while Harlan logged the procedure in his chart. No accusations, no suspicion, just a nod of approval as he handed her a fresh set of tools for the next patient. Word of the incident spread quietly among the nurses that night in the barracks, Greta's eyes lighting up as Anna recounted it over mended socks. "He treated you like one of us," Greta said, and others leaned in, sharing similar whispers. A guard sharing fruit, a medic explaining treatments without condescension. These small tales hinted at broader surprises waiting in the camp. "Alone," he said through the interpreter, his voice matter-of-fact, like discussing the weather. Enough to wrap the whole German army twice over. The number landed like a quiet bomb in Anna's mind. U.S. medical supplies had outnumbered the Axis 10-1 by 1945. A flood of production from factories that ran day and night, untouched by the bombings that crippled Europe's heart. Greta leaned forward, her eyes wide, and asked about the cars she had seen on the drive-in. those sleek Fords gliding along paved roads without a hitch. Tom chuckled, describing how his family owned one, complete with a radio that picked up baseball games from coast to coast. "Every household has one, more or less," he added, painting pictures of drive-in movies and corner stores stocked with fresh milk year-round. Anna listened, her spoon forgotten in the fruit juice, as others chimed in. A medic talking of supermarkets where canned goods lined aisles longer than a city block, powered by electricity that never blinked out. It shattered the old myths she'd swallowed whole. The decadent West wasn't crumbling under luxury. It thrived on it, a web of farms and rails feeding an army that could sustain itself across oceans. The propaganda had called it weakness, this reliance on machines and masses. But hearing of families picnicking in parks while German cities rationed turnips made her see the lie. Abundance wasn't greed, it was strength, the kind that wore down empires without a single wasted shot. As the fire died to embers, the group fell into quieter exchanges, Tom asking about Anna's home in Munich and listening without judgment as she spoke of Christmas markets reduced to ash. No gloating, just nods of understanding that echoed the thanks Private Ellis had given her weeks before. It felt disarming, this shared humanity under the wire, peeling away the layers of us versus them, like onion skins. Back in the barracks later, Anna lay awake, the stories replaying, the radios, the endless supplies, each one a thread unraveling the Reich's grand illusion. But deeper traumas surfaced the next day, when a fellow nurse, pale and withdrawn during shift, pulled her aside to confide fears from the front that no amount of plenty could erase. In quiet, hands shaking as she signed the oath, the room thick with the scent of polished boots and resolve, all to steel them against what they called the enemy's degenerate nature. Those echoes resurfaced sharply one humid morning when her colleague Maria, the nurse from Hamburg, faltered during a routine bandage change, her fingers trembling so badly the gauze slipped from her grip. They stepped outside to the edge of the yard, where cottonwoods rustled in a faint breeze, and Maria finally spoke, her voice a whisper swallowed by the wind. "It happened during the retreat near Aachen last fall," she said, eyes fixed on the ground as if seeing it all again. The advance had come swift, American tanks rolling through the woods, and in the scramble to evacuate the hospital, the women had hidden in a cellar as shells whistled overhead. When the firing stopped, a heavy silence fell, broken only by footsteps above, footsteps that dragged on for hours in her memory, leaving the group huddled in the dark, breaths held until dawn. No one spoke of the quiet terror that followed, the way hands clutched at skirts and eyes avoided contact. But the aftermath lingered like a bruise. Maria's refusal to eat full meals for weeks, her flinches at sudden noises, a world tilted where trust in men, any men, felt shattered. Thousands of Helferinnen like Maria and Anna had been captured by then, young women thrust into the fray, many bracing for the violence their propaganda foretold, stories of degradation from the gangster armies that ignored all rules of war. Back in Germany, radio broadcasts hammered it home. The Allies, especially the Americans, were driven by base instincts, their discipline a thin veil over savagery. Yet here in the camp, the contrast grew starker with each passing day. The U.S. medics treated the women's checkups with the same clinical care as the men's, doors closed for privacy, questions limited to health facts without a hint of intrusion. A female doctor even joined the rotations sometimes, her stethoscope cold, but her manner steady, enforcing the Geneva rules that promised safety for all prisoners, women included. It fostered a slow trust in. When the camp announced the supervised outing to the nearby town of Herne the following week, A chance for select prisoners to see the world beyond the wire, Anna signed up, curious if the everyday life outside would reveal even more about the enemy she was learning to question. Escorted to the nearby market in Herne on a crisp September morning, the sight of stocked shelves left Anna speechless. A world so brimming with goods, it felt like stepping into a dream, far removed from the ration cards and empty pantries of home. The group of 12 nurses, including Greta and Maria, climbed into an open truck under guard, the Texas wind whipping their hair as they bounced along dirt roads lined with fields heavy with ripening cotton. No one spoke at first, the wire fences of the camp shrinking in the rear view, but excitement bubbled up like the fizz in a soda bottle one guard offered as a treat. "Just a short trip," the sergeant driving explained, "to show you folks we're not monsters." Anna clutched the bench, her heart a mix of thrill and wariness, wondering if this glimpse of freedom was kindness or a clever trick to break their spirits further. The town square bustled with locals in wide-brimmed hats and Sunday dresses, farmers haggling over bushels of apples that gleamed red and untouched by famine. Inside the general store, wooden floors creaked underfoot as the women wandered aisles under watchful eyes, fingers trailing over cans of peaches, sacks of flour piled high, and bins of fresh oranges shipped from California groves. No queues snaking out the door, no arguments over the last loaf, just abundance on display, priced in dollars that made the American clerks smile broadly. Chocolate bars lined a shelf near the counter, Hershey's wrappers glinting in the sunlight through the windows, each one a solid block of sweetness Anna hadn't tasted since childhood, before the war's shortages turned treats into memories. She picked one up, the weight solid in her palm, and the shopkeeper nodded approval, even letting her break off a piece to sample. Rich, milky, melting on her tongue like forbidden joy. It wasn't just candy, it was a symbol of plenty, the kind the Reich's leaders had railed against as wasteful excess. Yet here, it fed a nation's wealth that sustained the fight. The propaganda had twisted it into jealousy, calling the U.S. a land of fat cats. But seeing families buy without fear made her question the industrial shortfall that left her own people hungry. The synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr shattered, leaving Panzers as scrap, while Shermans rolled endless. A quiet bitterness rose, not at the guards, but at the leaders who had promised supremacy yet delivered starvation. Greta bought a small bag of nuts with her camp-earned credits, her laughter light as they boarded the truck again, the chocolate's aftertaste lingering sweet. Back at the camp that afternoon, the outing's glow faded under the routine. But Anna carried the image of those shelves like a secret, a wedge prying open her doubts wider. The next day, a thin envelope from home arrived in the mail call, its stamps faded, and words from her family pulling the inner conflict into sharp focus once more. A thin envelope arrived during mail call that crisp October afternoon, its edges frayed from the long journey across the Atlantic, and as Anna slit it open with trembling fingers, the words from her mother painted a Germany in ashes, a homeland she barely recognized while she stood in the relative comfort of the Texas sun. The letter was dated August, just after the war's end in Europe, inked in her mother's careful script on paper yellowed by scarcity. "The city is rubble, darling," it began, describing Munich's streets choked with debris from the Allied bombings, families foraging through cellars for scraps as winter loomed without coal or warm coats. Her brother had lost his factory job, the lines at bakeries stretching hours for a loaf of sawdust bread. And neighbors whispered of the hunger that gnawed deeper than any propaganda could deny. Anna sat on her bunk, the paper crumpling in her grip, the clinic's distant hum fading, as guilt flooded her like the Rhine in spring. VE Day on May 8th had sealed the Reich's fate, but the scars ran deeper. By then, 70% of Germany's urban areas lay in ruins, factories silenced, and homes reduced to skeletons under the relentless weight of American and British bombers. Over 600,000 civilians dead. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg, mere shadows. The destruction so vast, it left millions wandering. Their lives round, a guard noticed her untouched tray and slid over an extra apple, his voice gentle through the interpreter. "Eat up. Keeps the strength in," he said. No demand, just concern, that mirrored the thanks Private Ellis had offered months before. The gesture, small and unasked for, deepened the budding empathy in her chest. These men weren't reveling in Germany's fall. They pitied it, sharing from their own abundance without a trace of gloat. It stirred a quiet anger at the leaders who had sent her here, feeding lies of a superior race, while their people starved. And for the first time, Anna saw the Americans not as victors, but as humans who had won through sheer will to provide, factories churning where the fatherland faltered. The inner tug-of-war intensified, shame blending with a fragile gratitude that made the walls of her beliefs tremble further. Greta found her later by the fence, watching the sunset bleed orange over the fields. And they talked in low voices about the letters flooding in, tales of occupation, rationing, the slow crawl toward rebuilding. "They think we're traitors for surviving," Greta murmured. But Anna shook her head, the apple's sweetness still on her tongue, a reminder of mercy unearned. As days passed, the camp buzzed with news of upcoming events to mark the war's close. And when word came of a special ceremony for the medical staff, Anna felt a pull toward it, sensing the real turning point loomed in the honors no enemy should give. On a crisp autumn day in late October 1945, the camp commandant called the nurses forward to the assembly ground, an honor they couldn't fathom. Their names read out over the crackle of a loudspeaker as if they were guests, not captives. The air held a chill that nipped at cheeks, leaves crunching underfoot, as Anna and her fellow Helferinnen lined up in their best uniforms, hearts pounding with a mix of confusion and dread. What reckoning could this be after months of quiet routines? The commandant, a stern colonel from Virginia with silver at his temples, stood on a wooden platform, flanked by flags waving gently in the breeze. His voice steady as he began, thanking the group not for surrender, but for the lives they had saved on the front lines, even those of his own men. The ceremony unfolded a reluctant bridge in the healing. One by one, the nurses stepped forward, receiving a handshake and a small parcel, a tin of real coffee beans, aromatic and dark, wrapped in paper that crackled like the leaves below. Anna's turn came mid-line, her boots scraping the platform as the colonel's grip met hers, firm but warm, his eyes meeting her own without triumph or scorn. "For the men you pulled back from the edge," he murmured, pressing the coffee into her palm, the weight of it heavier than its size. In that instant, the final myths shattered like glass underfoot. The enemy wasn't a faceless horde of gangsters or degenerates, but people capable of seeing shared threads of compassion. The war's ideology, a fragile lie spun from fear and control. Tears welled unbidden, tracing silent paths down her cheeks, not from humiliation, but from the raw clarity of it all. The Reich had taught her to hate what now offered grace. Her hands that once served tanks now linked in quiet acknowledgement with those who had conquered. The crowd of POWs and staff watched in hush, the moment stretching as if time itself paused, revealing the human cost beneath the banners. Greta squeezed her arm afterward. The coffee tins clutched like talismans, and whispers rippled through the group, a turning point none had sought, but one that etched deep. It marked the peak of Anna's unraveling, the propaganda's chains loosening in the light of simple thanks, leaving her to rebuild from the fragments. As months passed after that day, with repatriation whispers growing, the transformation deepened, shaping her days in ways that echoed far beyond the camp's fences. With peace declared across the Atlantic and the world inching toward recovery, Preparations for repatriation stirred mixed feelings in Anna's heart, a blend of longing for home and a quiet dread of the life waiting there. By early 1946, the camp's daily hum shifted. Paperwork stacks grew in the administration huts. Ships scheduled from East Coast ports, and the guards began casual lessons in English phrases like "welcome home" and "good luck." Anna threw herself into the final shifts at the clinic, teaching a young POW orderly how to measure doses, while her own mind wandered to the families she had written about. Divided nation, many carrying altered views that whispered against the old hatreds. Stories of American fairness spread in post-war reunions, seeds of reconciliation planted in unlikely soil. For Anna, it was more personal. The routines of respect, the shared meals, the thanks that echoed long after, had reshaped her lens on the world, replacing the Reich's iron myths with a fragile faith in human decency. She no longer saw the U.S. as a decadent giant, but as a place where industry and empathy had woven together to end the nightmare, leaving her to question the leaders who had gambled away so much for illusions. The inner reflections deepened during quiet walks in the rec yard, where frost now rimed the grass, Anna pondering the journey ahead to a Germany split by winners and losers, where her nursing skills might heal the wounded of peace rather than war. Guilt still tugged for the comforts she had known here, but pride flickered too, in the survival that let her carry truths home. A final gesture came on her last day at the clinic, a guard pressing a fresh bar of soap into her hand as she packed her kit, his words simple: "For a clean start." The ivory gleamed white, scented and unmarred, symbolizing not just cleanliness, but reclaimed dignity, the chance to wash away the propaganda's grime and step forward unburdened. It was a small thing, but in her palm it weighed like hope, the camp's lessons etched deep. As the group boarded the train east toward the ship in New York Harbor that spring, Anna clutched her bundle, letters, the locket, that bar of soap, her eyes on the horizon where the sea would carry her back. She carried lessons beyond the war, fragile seeds for a world rebuilding itself, ready to plant them amid the ruins. The Atlantic crossing mirrored Anna's journey inward, from the fear that had gripped her in Remagen to a fragile understanding forged in the Texas dust. The ship's steady roll a rhythm that carried her back to a Europe remade by surrender and rebirth. She stood at the rail often, the salt spray on her face mingling with memories of the camp, the clinic's steady hum, the fire-lit talks, the coffee's warmth that lingered like a promise. The voyage took 2 weeks, crowded with other repatriation tools, faces lined but lifted by the first real peace in years. Stepping onto the platform at home, her family enveloped her in arms thin from the lean times, tears mixing with questions about the other side. She spoke carefully at first, sharing tales of the ship's rough seas to sidestep the deeper shifts. But over evening soups made from Red Cross flour, the words came freer. The kindness in the camps, the myths that crumbled like the Reich's walls. In the months that followed, Anna found work in a makeshift clinic aiding the displaced, her skills honed on both sides, now blending into care without borders. She treated neighbors with penicillin vials from aid shipments, explained basic hygiene to those rebuilding from rubble, and watched as former soldiers, POWs like her, joined in the quiet work of mending. Many of those who had been held in America spoke out in hushed gatherings, their stories contributing to the threads of reconciliation that wove through post-war Europe. Efforts like the Marshall Plan's aid, which poured billions into recovery, turning enemies into partners in the slow thaw of hate. For Anna, it was personal victory. The shock of that unexpected humanity endured, a light against the propaganda's long shadow, guiding her hands as she bandaged wounds old and new. The inner transformation rippled outward in the way she taught her young niece about the world beyond flags, Lessons of shared tables and open hands, not iron fists. Guilt for the comforts she had known faded into resolve, fueling her days amid the hammers rebuilding Munich's squares. The war had taken much, but in its wake, Anna carried a truth harder won. People, stripped of uniforms, often found common ground in the simplest acts. It shaped her life quietly, a nurse's calling deepened by the mercy that had saved her own spirit. In the end, Anna's story shows how one act of kindness can dismantle years of hate, reminding us that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in the quiet moments of human connection. If these tales of history's hidden turns interest you, consider subscribing for more stories from the past.